She sold over 200 million records. She performed for presidents, for royalty, for stadiums that disappeared at the edges. And then, without warning, her own body declared war on her. There are artists who survive fame. And then there is a woman who survived everything fame could not prepare her for. Poverty, public humiliation, unbearable loss, and a disease so rare it affects 1 in a million people. One that steals the very muscles you need to stand on a stage. Most people know the voice. Almost no one knows the price. Because behind every song that made the world weep was a private story the spotlights never fully reached. A love the world tried to destroy for decades. A husband she watched die slowly while holding his hand. And a body that began collapsing from the inside just when she had survived everything else. How does a girl born 14th in a family with almost nothing become the most recognizable voice on earth? What did she sacrifice to protect a love the world refused to accept? And when fate took everything in 48 hours, how does someone like that decide to keep singing? To answer that, we have to go back to the beginning. To a small town in Quebec that barely appeared on maps, and a kitchen table where it all started. She was not born into music. She was born into survival. On March 30th, 1968, in the small town of Charlemagne, Quebec, a place so modest it barely registered on maps, Thérèse and Adhémar Dion welcomed their 14th child into a house already straining at its seams. 14 children, 1 salary, a kitchen that somehow fed them all, though never without effort and never without sacrifice. The Dion home was small enough that privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Beds were shared, meals were stretched, and winter came every year with the particular cruelty it reserves for families without enough. There were weeks when the cupboards offered almost nothing. Weeks when Thérèse Dion fed her children before feeding herself. A quiet heroism that Celine would only fully understand decades later, when she became a mother herself. But if poverty defined the walls of that house, music defined everything inside them. Adhémar played accordion. Thérèse sang. The older siblings played, composed, harmonized. Music was not entertainment in the Dion household. It was the language the family spoke when words were not enough. It was how they celebrated, how they grieved, how they held together through cold winters and tight months. Long before Celine understood what a stage was, she understood what a song could do. She had watched it happen at her own kitchen table her entire life. She was 5 years old when she first climbed onto that table and sang for the family. Not nervously, not shyly, with the kind of certainty that stops a room. Her brothers and sisters went quiet. Thérèse looked at Adhémar, and something unspoken passed between them. The recognition that this child was different, that what lived in her throat was not simply talent, but something that did not yet have a name. By the time she was 12, that something had a direction, even if the road ahead was still invisible. It was Thérèse who made the first move. She wrote a song, a handwritten composition called Ce n'était qu'un rêve, It Was Only a Dream, and mailed it with a homemade demo tape to René Angelil, one of the most respected music managers in Quebec, a man who had already built careers, a man who received hundreds of demos and discarded most of them before the first chorus ended. He almost discarded this one too, but something made him press play again, and then again. And when he finally called the Dion family to arrange a meeting, he arrived expecting a polished young performer with professional backing. Instead, he found a skinny 12-year-old girl in a modest living room who looked at him with dark, serious eyes and sang as if the room were an arena. René Angelil wept. He would later say it was the only time in his professional life that a voice had moved him to tears before he had even decided whether to sign the artist. He signed her immediately. And then he did something that revealed the full measure of his belief. He mortgaged his own house to finance her first album. Not an advance. Not a loan from a label. His house. His security. His personal declaration that this child's voice was worth everything he had. That decision changed both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. When Celine's first French-language albums found an audience in Quebec quickly. She was young, earnest, and vocally extraordinary in a way that transcended the usual calculations of the music industry. Critics noticed, radio noticed, and the Quebec public, often resistant to embracing stars before the rest of the world did, claimed her as their own with unusual speed. But fame in Quebec, even rapid and genuine fame, was still a long distance from the world. Rene saw that distance clearly, and his plan to close it was methodical, almost surgical. He pulled Celine from public view and invested in transformation, not of her talent, which needed nothing, but of her presentation. Dental surgery corrected teeth that cameras had already begun to notice. Styling replaced the homespun look of Charlemagne. French lessons became English lessons. And English lessons became something harder, the deliberate construction of a new public identity without erasing the authentic one underneath. Celine submitted to all of it with the discipline of someone who had grown up understanding that nothing came without work. She was not naive about what was happening. She was not being manufactured. She was being prepared. And she knew the difference. Years later, she said simply, "Rene believed in me before I believed in myself. Everything I became because someone first decided I was worth the risk." But there was another dimension to the relationship between Celine and Rene that the music industry was already beginning to notice, and that the public would eventually demand answers about. Rene Angelil was 26 years older than the girl he managed. He had been married twice, and he had children of his own. And as Celine moved from adolescence into early adulthood, what existed between them had quietly shifted from professional devotion into something neither of them could define publicly without consequence. By the time Celine was in her early 20s, they were in love. Deeply, privately, and with the full weight of a bond that had been building for nearly a decade. But the world, when it found out, was not kind. Headlines in Quebec, and eventually across Canada, framed the relationship in the harshest possible light. The age gap, impossible to ignore, impossible to explain away, invited speculation about power, about influence, about whether a girl discovered at 12 could ever truly have chosen freely as a woman. Critics were vocal. Tabloids were merciless. And Celine, who had given everything to her career and everything to this man, found herself defending not her talent, but her own heart. She did not flinch. "People can say what they want," she said in one early interview, her voice carrying no defensiveness, only quiet conviction. "I know what this is. I know who he is to me." It was not a performance of certainty. It was the real thing. The same directness that had made a 12-year-old girl stare down a powerful music executive and sing without nerves. Rene and Celine married in December 1994 at the Notre Dame Basilica in Montreal. The ceremony was broadcast on Canadian television. 1,200 guests attended. And Celine, in a wedding gown with a 7-pound tiara, he walked toward the man who had mortgaged his house for her voice and wept again. This time not as her manager, but as her husband. The girl from Charlemagne, who had grown up sharing a bed with siblings in a house where winter arrived before the heating did, now stood at the center of the most watched wedding in Canadian history. But the distance between that house and that basilica had not been traveled in comfort. It had been traveled in discipline, sacrifice, scrutiny, and a love the world had tried to talk her out of. She had survived all of it, and the world, whether it approved or not, was about to watch her become something it had never seen before. The world did not discover Céline Dion gradually. It discovered her all at once, and it was not prepared. In 1990, she stepped onto the Eurovision Song Contest stage, representing Switzerland with a song called Ne partez pas sans moi, Don't Leave Without Me. She was 21 years old, performing in a competition watched by over 600 million people across Europe, a continent where her name meant nothing, and her accent marked her as an outsider twice over. Too Canadian for Europe, too French for the English-speaking world. She won by a single point. It was the kind of margin that could have been a footnote. Instead, it became a detonator. Overnight, Céline Dion existed on a map that extended beyond Quebec, beyond Canada, beyond the careful plans Rene had been building for years. Her Eurovision had given her something no strategy could manufacture, a moment the world had watched together and remembered. The English-language albums followed with the precision of someone who had been patient long enough. Unison in 1990, Céline Dion in 1992, The Color of My Love in 1993, each one larger than the last, each one pushing her voice into spaces that other voices could not reach, not simply in range, but in emotional weight, in that particular quality she possessed of making a listener feel that the song had been written specifically for them, that she was not performing, but confessing. The Power of Love reached #1 in the United States. Then Think Twice in the United Kingdom, where it spent weeks at the top of the charts and became one of the longest-running #1 singles in British history. Then, Because You Loved Me. Then, It's All Coming Back to Me Now. A 7-minute operatic pop epic that should not have worked on commercial radio and became inescapable. Critics who had dismissed her as too polished, too earnest, too unironic for the mid-90s were forced into an uncomfortable reckoning. Céline Dion was not a trend. She was not a product of careful marketing dressed up as authenticity. She was something the industry encountered rarely enough that it didn't always recognize it when it arrived. An artist whose instrument was so singular that genre became irrelevant. And then came Titanic. In 1997, James Cameron's film was already the most expensive production in Hollywood history before a single ticket was sold. Its fate was uncertain enough that the studio had considered releasing it without a title song. Cameron himself was resistant to the idea of a traditional cinematic ballad closing his epic. He wanted something that felt earned rather than imposed, something that did not sentimentalize what the film had worked 3 hours to make real. He sent the demo of My Heart Will Go On to Rene. Rene played it for Celine. She recorded it in a single take. One pass, no second attempt, with the raw immediacy of someone who understood instinctively that the song could not survive being polished. That rawness, that first-breath quality, is audible in the final recording to anyone who listens for it. And the slight catch in the opening phrase, the way the first chorus lands as if it surprised even her. When Titanic became the highest-grossing film in history, and My Heart Will Go On became inescapable. In elevators, in shopping centers, at weddings, at funerals, at every emotional threshold, human beings cross. Céline Dion did not simply become famous. She became something rarer and more complicated. She became a shared cultural experience, a voice attached not to a biography, but to a feeling. Millions of people who could not have named another song she had recorded felt with complete sincerity that her voice belonged to them. At the peak of that wave, she had sold more than 100 million records. She had performed for presidents and royalty. So she had stood on stages in stadiums and felt the specific vertigo of looking out at a crowd so large the far edges disappeared into darkness. She had achieved everything the girl from Charlemagne had been told, directly and indirectly, was not meant for someone like her. And yet in private, something was already shifting. René Angelil, the man who had built all of this with her, the man whose belief had preceded her own, was sick. In 1998, Rene was diagnosed with throat cancer. The cruelty of the diagnosis was not lost on anyone who understood what was at stake. The man who had devoted his life to a voice now faced a disease that attacked the throat. The manager who had spent decades protecting Celine's instrument was fighting for his own survival in the same anatomical neighborhood where her gift lived. There was a terrible symmetry to it that neither of them acknowledged publicly, because some symmetries are too cruel to name out loud. Celine did not hesitate. She announced that she was stepping away, not reducing her schedule, not delegating more responsibilities, not managing the crisis from a distance while maintaining her career at partial capacity. She was stopping, fully, completely. The tours, the recordings, the appearances, everything that constituted Céline Dion, the global phenomenon, was placed on hold, so that Céline Dion, the wife, could sit beside her husband in a hospital and hold his hand. The industry was stunned. Artists at her level did not do this. The machinery of global fame does not pause gracefully. It atrophies, it loses momentum, it forgets you exist with the same speed it once declared you essential. Advisors warned her. Executives made careful arguments about timing and market position and the difficulty of recapturing an audience that had moved on. She listened, and then she did what she had always done when the world tried to talk her out of something she knew was right. She stayed. For 2 years, she was not a recording artist. She was a wife. She sat through chemotherapy sessions. She managed the fear that arrives in the small hours of the morning when treatment statistics refuse to arrange themselves into comfort. She watched the man who had always been the steady center of her world become fragile, and she did not look away from that fragility or try to soften it into something easier to carry. She looked at it directly, as she had always looked at difficult things, with the particular courage of someone who has learned that the only way through is through. Rene survived. The cancer retreated. Treatment worked. And in 1999, he was well enough that a different kind of announcement became possible. Not the announcement of illness, but of return. But Celine did not simply return to where she had been. She returned to something larger. On the Caesars Palace residency in Las Vegas, A New Day Has Come was, at the time, unlike anything the entertainment industry had attempted with an artist of her stature. Rather than tours that moved across continents, consuming months, and stranding a recovering husband in transit, she would stay in one city, in one spectacular show, for years. The audience would come to her. The production, designed by Franco Dragone and built on a scale that made Broadway productions look modest, cost $100 million to construct. It ran from 2003 to 2007, drawing over 700,000 people and generating more than $400 million in ticket revenue. It was called a gamble by everyone who analyzed it before it opened. Afterward, it was called a blueprint. Our Celine performed more than 700 shows. She did so while Rene recovered fully, while their son, René Charles, grew from infancy into childhood, while the family built a life in Las Vegas that was, by all accounts, genuinely happy. She was not simply surviving in this period. She was thriving, on her own terms, in a form she had helped invent, in a city that became unexpectedly home. For a moment, it seemed as if the worst was behind them. It was not. For years, Celine and Rene had wanted more children. The desire was uncomplicated and human. They had love to give. They had a son who filled their world, and they wanted to expand that world further. What they encountered instead was the particular grief reserved for couples who want a child and cannot have one easily. The clinical language of fertility treatments, the monthly arithmetic of hope and disappointment, the way the desire for something natural begins to feel, over time, like a test that the body is failing. She spoke about it with a candor that many celebrities in her position would have withheld. She described the cycles of in vitro fertilization, the injections, the waiting, the losses, not asking for sympathy, but refusing to pretend that the life behind the performances was uncomplicated. "Ma, I wanted to give Rene more children," she said in an interview that stopped the usual machinery of celebrity deflection cold. We tried many times, and every time it didn't work, I grieved, quietly, but completely." In 2010, after years of trying, she gave birth to twin boys, Nelson and Eddie. The joy was enormous and genuine. René Charles was 9 years old enough to understand what it meant to have brothers, young enough to be transformed by it. René, who had now been in remission for over a decade, held his newborn sons with the expression of a man who had been close enough to mortality to understand, bone deep, what it meant to still be present for this moment. Celine, who had spent her career translating human emotion into sound, found that this particular emotion resisted translation. "Nothing I have ever sung," she said, "comes close to what it felt like to hold them." But the twins arrived into a family that was also carrying, quietly, a weight the celebrations could not dissolve. René's cancer had retreated once. There was no guarantee it would not return. His age, he was 68 when the twins were born, meant that the arithmetic of time was simply different for him than for her. They both knew it. They did not discuss it constantly, because there are some truths that are most bearable when you live alongside them rather than inside them. But it was there, in the pauses, in the way he looked at his sons, in the way she watched him look at his sons. The world, watching the photos of the family, saw triumph. A superstar mother of 3, a resilient husband, a beautiful life constructed from difficulty and devotion. What they saw was real. What they could not see was also real. In 2013, René's cancer returned. This time, it was different. Not in the way cancer is discussed in clinical terms, staging, prognosis, treatment protocols, but in the way it was different for them, as people who had already been through it once and had believed, with the specific hope of survivors, that the first victory was also the final one. It was not. René began treatment again, and this time the treatment was harder because he was older, because the disease had returned with more determination, and because the body that had fought once does not always have the same reserves to fight twice. Celine reduced her schedule again, then reduced it further. Then, in increments that the public watched without fully understanding what they were witnessing, she began to disappear from the foreground of her own career. She was not managing a pause this time. She was managing a farewell. René's decline was slow enough to be merciful in some ways and cruel in others. There were months when he rallied enough that optimism felt rational again. Months when the family could be together in ordinary ways. Meals, conversations, the boys growing. René Charles becoming a young man who had inherited his mother's musical instincts and his father's quiet strength. And then there were the other months, the ones that did not allow for optimism, the ones that Celine has never described in detail, because some rooms are private even for someone whose entire life has been lived in public. On January 14, 2016, René Angelil died at their home in Las Vegas, and he was 73 years old. He had been married to Celine for 21 years. He had been the central figure of her life, professionally, personally, emotionally, for 34 years. More than half of her entire existence on Earth had been oriented around this man. His belief had preceded her own. His sacrifice had made her first album possible. His love had been the subject of public scrutiny, tabloid speculation, and the kind of sustained outside judgment that most relationships do not survive. Theirs had not only survived it, it had deepened through it, been refined by illness, tested by loss, and ultimately confirmed by the fact that when it mattered, not on stages or in interviews, but in hospital rooms and quiet evenings and the slow, irreversible erosion of a long illness, she had stayed, without condition, and without performance, without asking for credit. 2 days later, Celine's brother Daniel died of cancer as well. 48 hours, 2 deaths. The man who had been her everything, and a brother whose life had run alongside hers since childhood, in that crowded house in Charlemagne. 2 losses compressed into a space so small it defies ordinary comprehension. She did not cancel the memorial services. She did not collapse into invisibility. She stood up, in black, and she spoke. About Rene, about love, about what it means to lose the person who knew you longest and best. Her voice, the instrument she had given everything to protect, held. And in the holding of it, in the extraordinary composure that is often misread as coldness, but is in fact the deepest form of strength, she gave the watching world something it did not expect. She gave it proof that love, at its most real, does not perform grief. It simply carries it. She returned to her Las Vegas residency 2 months later. The first performance back was not announced as a comeback or a triumph. She did not frame it that way, and she would have been right not to. She simply walked onto the stage, stood in the light, and sang. Because that was what she knew how to do. Because Rene had believed in that voice before anyone else had, and to stop using it would have been a betrayal of everything he had staked on it. The audience that night did not simply applaud. They wept. And so, quietly, out of view of the cameras, did she. For most of her life, Céline Dion's body had been the instrument's servant. She had maintained it with the precision of a professional athlete. Vocal rest, careful diet, controlled environments, the endless, unglamorous discipline of someone whose work depends on a biological mechanism that cannot be replaced or repaired if it fails. She knew, better than almost anyone alive, how fragile the gift was. How many things could take it. What she did not know, what no one around her knew, because the disease was rare enough that most doctors never encountered it, was that her body had been preparing a betrayal of a different kind entirely. Not gradual deterioration from overuse. Not the expected consequences of decades of performance. Something far stranger, far crueler, and far more isolating. In 2022, Céline Dion announced that she had been diagnosed with stiff person syndrome. The name sounds almost bureaucratic for what the condition actually does. Stiff person syndrome is a rare neurological disorder, so rare that it affects roughly 1 in a million people. in which the immune system attacks the nervous system, causing progressive muscle stiffness and spasms of such severity that they can fracture bones, dislocate joints, and make the act of walking feel like forcing movement through setting concrete. The spasms can be triggered by noise, by touch, by stress, by nothing at all. They arrive without warning and depart without apology. There is no cure. The world received this news with the particular shock reserved for the revelation that someone perceived as invincible is not. Céline Dion, who had sung through grief and through fear, through the death of her husband and the loss of her brother, who had stood in spotlights for 40 years with the kind of physical command that made the stage seem built specifically for her. This woman, this voice, was being dismantled from the inside by a disease so obscure that most of the doctors she initially saw had never treated it before. She had been experiencing symptoms for years before the diagnosis. The world had been watching without understanding. There were performances where something seemed slightly different, a movement less fluid, a moment of tension behind the composure. She had continued. Because continuing was what she had always done. Because the machinery of her career, of her family's security, of the people who depended on her professionally, did not pause easily. Because she did not yet have a name for what was happening to her body. And without a name, it was harder to justify stopping. When the name finally arrived, it arrived with the heavy clarity of something that cannot be unfound. She canceled her world tour. The Courage Tour, which had already been postponed repeatedly due to the pandemic, and then due to health reasons that were now, at last, explained, was gone. The arenas that had been booked, the stages that had been designed, the audiences that had been waiting. All of it released into uncertainty, because the woman at the center of it all was fighting a disease that attacked the very muscles she needed to stand, to move, to breathe, to sing. In a video released to her fans, she did not hide. She was visibly thinner than the world was accustomed to seeing her, and her hands moved with a slight tremor. Her voice, speaking rather than singing, carried the particular fragility of someone describing something they have not yet found a way to fully contain in words. She spoke of her symptoms with directness. She asked for patience. She did not ask for pity, a distinction that was both deliberate and entirely characteristic. I'm working hard with my sports medicine therapist every day to build back my strength and my ability to perform again, she said. But I have to be honest with you, this has been a real struggle. What she did not say, but what everyone watching understood, was that for the first time in her life, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The voice had survived grief. The body had survived loss. But this, a disease with no cure, attacking the nervous system with the indifference of something that does not know or care what it is destroying. This was a different category of challenge entirely. She retreated into her family. René Charles, now in his mid-20s, became a quiet protector. The twins, Nelson and Eddie, teenagers now carrying their father's name and their mother's eyes, became the reason mornings were worth the effort of beginning them. Friends described a household that had reorganized itself around her care. Not in the dramatic way of a crisis, but in the steady, ordinary way of people who love someone and decide, without announcement, to rearrange their lives around that love. She began intensive physical therapy. She worked with specialists in neurological disorders. She adjusted medications, or endured the side effects of treatments that managed symptoms without resolving the underlying disease, and rebuilt, slowly, painfully, with the same discipline she had once applied to vocal exercises and stage preparation. The basic physical capacities that most people never think about because their nervous systems allow them to take those capacities for granted. Standing, walking across a room without assistance, lifting her arms above her head. Things that had once been invisible, unconscious, unremarkable parts of the preparation for a performance that could fill a stadium. These became the performance themselves. The audience was no longer 20,000 people. It was a physical therapist, her sons, and the mirror in a rehabilitation room. She did not perform publicly for years. In that silence, the silence of a voice that the world had heard for 4 decades, suddenly absent. Something became audible that the performances had always carried, but that only became fully clear in their absence. How much of herself she had given. How completely she had understood from the beginning that the voice was not hers to keep, that it had always been borrowed, that every song had been a form of offering, made freely, held briefly, and released. The silence asked whether there would be more offerings, whether the body that had served the voice so faithfully for so long had enough left, whether the stage, that place that had been more familiar to her than almost any other place on earth, would ever hold her again. She did not know, but she had not stopped trying to find out. In 2024, Céline Dion did something that no medical prognosis, no cautious advisor, and no rational calculation of risk could fully explain. She sang at the Olympics. On the night of July 26th in Paris, on the Eiffel Tower, illuminated against the sky of the city that had been one of the first to receive her voice as something extraordinary. She stood, visibly thinner than the world remembered, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone for whom every step is a negotiation with a body that does not always cooperate, but standing, present, real. And then she opened her mouth. She sang L'Hymne à l'amour, Edith Piaf's hymn to love, to loss, to the belief that love is worth every cost it demands. The song floated across the Seine, into the ears of billions watching across the world, and carried with it something that pure technical vocal performance cannot manufacture. It carried the weight of everything she had survived to still be there. The poverty of Charlemagne, the scrutiny of a love the world had tried to dismantle, the years beside a hospital bed, the 48 hours that took her husband and her brother within 2 days of each other, the disease that had spent years dismantling her from the inside. All of it was in the voice, not as performance, as truth. The world watching that night did not simply hear a singer returning to a stage. They heard something rarer, a human being refusing, with every breath, to be finished. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Not the ordinary applause of appreciation, but the kind of collective emotional release that happens when an audience recognizes something they had not known they needed to see. Proof that endurance is real, that the body, even when it betrays us, can sometimes be persuaded to give one more thing. That love, even when it ends, continues to produce music. She wept afterward. Not on stage. She held herself together for the performance with the discipline of 4 decades. But afterward, in private, surrounded by her sons, she allowed what the cameras had not been permitted to see. Because some things are not for the world. Some things are only for the people who stayed. Today, Céline Dion continues to live with stiff person syndrome. There is still no cure. The mornings are still a negotiation. The disease has not been defeated. It has been managed, resisted, or refused the final word it has been demanding. She works with her medical team daily. She moves through her house in Henderson, Nevada, with the careful attention of someone who has learned not to take a single step for granted. René is a young man now, carrying a quiet steadiness that speaks to what he watched and absorbed during the years his family reorganized itself around survival. Nelson and Eddie are growing into the sons of a father they were too young to fully remember, and a mother whose courage they have watched at close range long enough to understand what it actually looks like. Not the version the stages show, but the version that gets up in the morning when getting up is hard. She has said she wants to perform again. Not as a declaration of victory over the disease, but as a continuation of something she has always understood about herself. That the voice is not the point. The voice is the vehicle. The point is the connection. The moment when a song crosses the space between one human being and another and says, "You are not alone in this." Whatever this is for you, grief, joy, longing, the particular ache of loving someone you cannot keep, you are not alone. That has always been what she was doing. On the stages, and in the hospital rooms, and in the rehabilitation center, and on the Eiffel Tower on a July night when the world held its breath. She was never performing invincibility. She was performing something far more difficult. She was performing the truth that fragility and strength are not opposites, that you can be both at once, that you can be broken and still beautiful, so still present, still singing. The girl from Charlemagne, who grew up sharing beds and stretching meals and listening to her mother sing before there was enough, understood this before she understood anything else. Some voices are not given to entertain. Some voices are given to remind us what it means to be human. Hers is one of those voices, and it is, against every odd, still here. If her story moved you, share it. Subscribe for more untold chapters. And remember that behind every voice that has ever given you something, there is a life that paid for every note.